Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome back to the lecture series on basics of working drawing. Today we will try to look at we'll observe the site planning and layout part 1. So in the previous lectures we did look at the upper floor plans, the intermediate plans, the typical floor plans, and ultimately the terrace and the roof plan. So now we look at finer details of the larger site layout. Right. So, we'll start with a new module today. So, in this module we will cover the representation of the buildings, the representation of roads and other site level details which are to be drawn in a site plan. Right. So, we are looking at site planning and layout of the plan. Okay. Moving on forward. Right. So, site plan basically is a detailed plan or the extreme top view of a site, right, of an existing site or with additions of proposed elements which are there, right. It is devised to access the entry and exit to the plot, right. So, we will identify a particular spot from where you enter the site and you are going to get out of that particular plot. So, we definitely have to identify that one thing in the site plan, right. It gives you an idea, right. Then the plan also gives you the layout of structures which are there, typically showing the roof of that particular structure, right. So, on the site layout you will have the basic site plan, you will have the basic layout of the buildings which are there and all the existing structures which are there, right. So, you will include all of this. Furthermore, you determine what is the gradient, what is the contour, what is the slope of the particular site which we are talking about. So, if the site has a slope, if there is a hill or the site itself is on a hill slope, then we also have to give contour lines something like this, somewhat like this, alright. So, we also represent it with contour lines. Furthermore, if there are vegetation spots on the site, we have to represent them as well. For example, if there is some existing vegetation which is around the site like this, you have to represent it accordingly. Furthermore, internal pathways which are for circulation in that particular area within your site, within where you have done your proposal as architect, there you have to show the internal circulation layout as well, internal pathways, the circulation on the site and how the site connects to the road on the outside. So, till that point all of the things are to be taken care of, right. Now, what else does it say? What else does the slide say? It is part of the set of construction drawings given to the contractor which helps in smooth planning and execution of the building with respect to the site. This is very important. So, even if you are doing a simple building without having the site plan, how to actually place the building, the contractor will never know that how to place the building, right. So, the idea of how to place the building on a particular site is being communicated through the site plan. So, this is a very important component of the complete construction drawings or complete working drawing set which are to be given to a contractor for execution, right, very important. Moving forward, now how does a roof plan which we did in previous module differs from a site plan, right. We will go point by point individually and I'll try to explain and elaborate each of these. Okay. So, the first one, when we look at a site plan is essentially the top view of the site including the building and site elements, right. So, three important things. One is it is a top view, second it will have the building and it will have the site elements, everything that is there in the site, right. So, all of those things which you will see are these, the building, the site elements, which is kind of represented in this particular example here, right. Next, it shows the proposals made to the site. So, the additional proposals which are being made to the site, they will be visible in the site plan, right. The roof type of the particular building is also mentioned here. So, looking at this example, you do see that it is a hip roof which is being proposed here. So, this kind of a structure, you understand that yes, this will have a hip roof, and but we don't know how many floors it is, right. So, that we will know from the typical floor plan. So, here what we do know is what is the level of the hip floor and what are the interacting context around that particular site, which will interact with this particular location or this particular building which we have proposed, right. Furthermore, site plan is of a much larger scale and it provides the complete overview or complete view of the site that we have, right. So, that is very, very important, alright. So, that is point number 3. Okay. So, it provides a complete overview. Now, in comparison to the site plan, how does the roof plan differ? The roof plan, right, is just a zoomed level of this particular area of the building, right, this particular part or component of the building, right. Okay. So, this area of the building will be highlighted in case of a roof plan of the proposed building, right. It shows the design of the roof, its dimensions, its construction method on a smaller scale compared to the site plan, right. So, the scale differs. So, point number 1 is the scale differs. Point number 2 is the amount of elements, the number of elements, they differ, and point number 3 is both are top views, but the site plan will include more information. The site plan will include more information compared to the roof plan, more information in site plan, right. Now, that is an important detail. So, this is how we can summarize how these two differ, right. Now, when we go to a site, we are trying to develop a particular location. The important thing that we require is a site survey. Usually, architects hire site surveyors, or they have a team of inbuilt. If it is a very large office, they would often have people who are doing the surveying activity for a particular site, but in most cases you will see that the work is being outsourced or the work is being given to some surveying agency which will go on the land, which will go on the location of the site, and they will survey the whole land or survey the whole area, right. Now, just to give you a context of what exactly happens in that case is there is an instrument called as the total station, which uses laser ranging technology to calculate and measure the dimensions of the different points of the site and come out with an accurate dimension of the site, accurate dimension where what kind of angles are. So, for example, if a site is somewhat like this, right, if you have a site where the land parcel is something like this. So, at each of the vertices, this station will be put down, and at multiple locations in the middle as well, it will be put down to get the exact dimensions of this particular site. These activities the surveyor group does, right. It should, this particular instrument you can see from this ocular. To observe on the other side, you have to manage and identify this particular point which will be placed at a distance, right. So, just to give you an additional context, this is somewhat you go and measure the site. So, you have the total station placed at one location, and from there you start measuring for reference points. For example, there is an existing structure which you have right there on the site. So, you will put down your total station, you will go and start measure the apex of it, so as to understand whether the angle of the total station is identifying it correctly, and then you will get additional reference points on the site, like here it is mentioned B and C, right. So, that is how you do survey and you place that particular point which is in reference with the actual stationary building a building won't move, right? Maybe trees might get cut down, billboards might move. So it is always recommended that you identify one simple place wherein you will have a point of reference which will not move, which will be stationary for the rest of the time, right, till the time your building is being executed, till the time your construction is being completed, right. Now, coming to another example which is here. So, what is happening in this case is, say for example, you definitely know that this particular building is not going to move. So, 2 points become your reference point for identifying the location of the total station, right. Next is you use 2 junctions, which is edge of the road on either sides and edge of the footpath on either sides to get another reference, right. So, it is double, triple, 4 times or 6 times probably has 6 references. It has been checked 6 times to identify this one particular location, right. So, the intersection of all of these points will give you the position of the total station which is there. Now, why is that important? To identify the location of total station from where your land starts, you can actually plot the first point, which is probably A in this which is probably this point in this case, right. So, this is probably your edge of the street or edge of your plot, right, these 2 black lines which are there, right. So, that is the edge of your plot which is visible in this example as here. So, all the red lines which you see are exactly where you want to draw the pit, you want to dig the pit for the foundation of your building, right. So, you want to develop your building and you need to make a foundation for your building. So, in that particular case, you have to first measure the area and you also need to identify from where this particular point will start, where you will create the pit for your foundation, right. Now, most of this is taught in survey and leveling modules or building construction, but I am just trying to give you a recap of that, right. So, this will be probably the pit from where you will start your construction. However, to identify that particular location, you need to place your total station and ranging rods. Total stations will be placed all along these places called A, A1, A2, A3 and so on so forth, and this way A4, A5, A6, A7 so on so forth till C, right. And then you try to identify the location of the pit which will create your foundation for your building, right. So, the hatched area, the area which is darker here in this particular part. So, this particular area you can draw and identify, which will become your pit for your construction, right. So, that is why surveying is very important and it is directly linked to your site, right. So, when a site plan is being done, one of the sheets will also have the location of where the total station has been put and from which point of reference your drafting has started for the dimensions of the plot. However, this drawing which I just mentioned usually comes from the surveyor's company, not from the architect's office, right. If the architect has an in-house group which does site survey, only then the architect's office produces this, else in most cases this particular drawing comes from the site surveyor's office, right. Moving forward, now in a site plan, what all things are really important when you are doing a site plan, what all things are actually really important, right. And a site plan is used to do what all things, right. So, that is what we will discuss in the subsequent slide, right. So, in the site plan, the uses particularly are the visual representation of the design that you are going to put down. So, when we say master plan of a particular location, the first drawing that comes in a master plan is the actual master plan. However, the second drawing which is shown in the master plan is without the rendering, you have a actual site plan which shows the dimensions of the site, which shows the expanse of the site, how large the site is. Say for example, from in this case it is from here to here and then the dimensions are somewhat like this, right. So, you have a very different irregular kind of a shape in this case, right. It is kind of a semi trapezoid. So, Next, you have a communication document between the contractor and the architect. So, this particular plan becomes a very important tool to actually identify the multiple drawings or plots which have been identified in this case. For example, this looks like a small township which is to be developed with multiple units which will be proposed here, right. You have multiple units which will be proposed here. So, in this case, the architect may immediately refer that, okay, I am talking about this one particular block which is probably named B2, this is probably B1, right. So, I am not talking about B1, but I am talking about B2. This is something an architect might say, and immediately the contractor can refer to the site plan and check that yes, B2 exists here and B2 is the block which you are talking about, right. So, they have an immediate reference. So, that is where the site plan really helps, right. Next, it becomes a guide for construction. For example, if a reference, again going back to that previous example of B2, if the architect refers to B2 and then says that, okay, your C1 which is this is 3 blocks away from B2, right, 1, 2, 3, 3 blocks away from B2. So, the contractor may say that yes, you are correct, that yes, from B2 3 blocks away we can go to C1, right. So, that is how you can refer to some of the locations. Then opposite to B2 is say D1, right. So, opposite to B2 is D1. So, that is one way of giving references when the architect is actually not on the site, and say the architect is on some other site, but somehow there is an issue that is happening which is probably going to delay some work. So, the contractor may immediately contact the architect using this as a reference sheet which is down on the table in front of the contractor. So, reference becomes easier, and often you would see that when sites are under execution, there is a particular project which is under execution. Mostly in case of large projects, you will see that on the site office usually there is a very large print of the complete site plan. So, everyone can come and refer to that particular site plan where what kind of things are and where which kind of utilities are there. And on the site plan itself, there are sometimes also mentions of evacuation plan in case of a very large site, right. Say a site of around 1 million square meter, right. So, 1 million square feet is the footprint of a building, right. So, that is how they are going to develop a particular area, right. So, it is a very large site. So, to understand where to go, how to move around, probably the visual connection will not come when you are on the site. But say if there is an accident on the site, everyone should know where are the points of evacuation, where you should be coming out, where you should be going to actually move out towards safety, right. So, on a large scale site plan, these locations of evacuation are always mentioned, which is very, very important, right. Next, you can also see the level of softscape, like in this case you have some trees here, there is a green patch here, and then hardscape, that you have a road, a internal road which does the distribution of people. There is a cul-de-sac here, and then people move here, there is another cul-de-sac here, right. So, that way you have the hardscape as well, right. So, all of these details are also visible. The main access to the street from the main street or the main road is from here, right. So, you have the entrance gate, and from there you do the navigation within this particular site, right. Also, this becomes the first drawing to approve a particular project. So, you are going to show how distant this particular location or the first building is from the main street, how distant the neighboring buildings are, that you are maintaining a setback, or whatever regulations and rules are there in that municipal corporation where you are executing the project. All of the details are represented in spatial format, in drawing format, with respect to the rules and regulation, the development control rules and regulation of that particular municipal corporation, right. So, when you submit that drawing for approval, this becomes one of the first drawings which the approving authority will probably open and check that yes, there are setbacks which are being followed on all sides. However, some places, if you see, if the approver observes that okay, at this point maybe the setback wasn't followed, the approving agency will encircle that, hatch it and send it back that you need to fix this particular location so that we don't have issues in future, right. You need to follow the setback guidelines and regulations as given by the municipal corporation, right. So, these are some of the things which are to be taken care of. However, a site plan really helps in that, right. And lastly, it becomes a permanent record, right. It becomes a permanent record of all of the design proposals which are given. Say for example, you are doing this kind of a township again, you are doing this kind of a township, but your client says that okay, this I can treat as option 1. What are the other options that you have? Right. So, you may produce 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 options probably, right. 10 options are produced for this particular site, right. So, each of the site plan that has been developed becomes one record of you doing a design proposal, right. Some of the architect's office also charge according to the number of options that are being generated, right. So, if you are generating say 2 options, it is charged in a different way. If you are generating 3, 4, 5 options, it is charged in a different way. If you are producing reiterations or revisions to a already decided upon site plan, right. So, for example, you are moving this particular block from here to this location and you are changing some of the site design parameters here. So, architect's office will probably charge it in a different way, that you are moving these 2 blocks say here and here. So, this revision will cost you this much. This is something an architect potentially might say to the client, right. So, that also shows, like for example, you will have one option wherein these 2 blocks are not here and another option which is with these 2 blocks here. So, you have 2 options of the same design, right. So, both the options will become something that you can bill the client for, right. So, that is a evidence that you have done the work and it is a permanent record of that, right, which can be always produced. Okay. So, what are the different components, right? As previously I mentioned, we will also discuss the components. So, as we saw in the surveying slide, that we usually hire a surveyor to go and check the different parameters of the site, right. All of those parameters which are collected by the site surveyor are often represented here, right. The dimensions, the orientation, the boundary, how much is the distance of the boundary from the main street, how are 2 different boundaries or 2 opposite boundaries of the site varying from each other in terms of level, in terms of distance, in terms of angle, dimension, the kind of setbacks that are to be followed as per the municipal corporation or as per the rules that are being followed for that particular area, right. The number of parking that are available on the street, on the side, whether it is open parking, whether it is closed parking, whether it can be put inside the site or whether there is some existing parking that can be used for the site. So, all of these things are to be taken care of by the surveyor and represented here. Now, in addition to that, what all do you do? How do you represent as an architect these information in the site plan, right. So, the first thing is it needs to have a north point indicating where the particular north is, right, a north point to be indicated, right. So, where the north of that particular site is, that is to be indicated, right. Next, you need to draw a thick line which accurately depicts the site boundary, right. For example, you have a site like this. So, all of this is required to be represented in a very thick line, right. So, usually on your CAD softwares you have something called as line weight. So, a heavier line weight is being used to show a thick line along the site boundary, right. So, that demarcates that your site expanse is this much. Next, you need to demarcate the setbacks, right. So, distance between the distance between the site line, where is the site, and say for example, you are going to have a house which is like this, right, and there probably is another pool or something like that here. So, in this block you need to demarcate where is the setback, how much is the setback from the individual site boundaries which are there, right. All of these distances are to be measured and shown. So, that becomes really important. Next, you need to show your parking. So, in most cases what we have often now, if it is a bungalow kind of a structure which you are proposing on a large site, or even for that matter any kind of building which you will propose, you will have either open parking or you will have a covered parking, right. So, in case of open parking, you really need to show the parking dimensions which are there, the number of cars which will be parking in that particular location. Also, you need to mention how many number of parking bays you have. In case of larger structures, say for example, you are developing a design for a mall and you will have a basement. So, even in the basement plan you show the parking, but if you have surface level parking, that needs to be shown in the site plan. All right. So, that is very important. Okay. So, all of the parking also is being shown which is on the surface, right. Next, we have landscape, right. So, all the hardscape and softscape which is finally designed, agreed upon by the client and the architect, and they are going to do that on the site as a live project. So, all of that hardscape and softscape need to be represented on the site plan. Next, your internal pathways, right. So, all of your pathways which are within the site, within the area which you are going to design, and you have proposed a design for that particular area. So, you will include all the footpaths, all the driveways wherever you want your want to take your car or scooter or say Segway, you are going to take it within the site. All of that hardscape is to be represented in terms of pathway, and there will be a different hatching which will be done to it. However, in addition to that, if you are saying that yes, this particular location will have a motorable or drivable pathway, then all the places where it is going to curve and all the places where it is going to change the sizes, you have to mention the dimensions and the turning radius. Particularly here, wherever the pathway turns, you have to mention the turning radius, right. So, that is very, very important. And in case of dimensions, if your pathway is like this, you will show the dimensions after some distance, right. Wherever it changes the size, you have to mention the dimension. All dimensions of the site are to be represented with a check, right. So, on the site plan, 4-5 types of dimensions are very, very important. Firstly, preliminary, the outer side dimensions. So, all the dimensions of this particular site you will have somewhat like this, right. Right. In addition to that, all the building dimensions are also to be represented, right. Next, all the pathway dimensions are to be mentioned, all the water bodies dimension are to be mentioned, all the hardscape and softscape dimensions are to be mentioned, and this is done in the hierarchical order, right, meaning that the longest dimensions go on the outside of the drawing, right. We will look at an example. So, the longest dimension will obviously be the site dimension, then within that is the building dimension, within that is the hardscape, softscape, within that is the pathway dimension, so on and so forth, right. So, this is an example, of a site which you have. So, the site boundary is represented in dash dot fashion, which you have here in red, right. So, all of this is the site boundary, and in some of the cases architects often mention that this is the site boundary, right. So, that we do not draft, or if it is handed down to a design team, they should also know that these are the expanses of the site and it should not be exploited further, right. So, probably say in this particular example, the allowed setback is about 2 feet, you should not go below 2 feet, right. So here you see 2 feet 2 inches, here you see 2 feet, right. So the maximum a person can go really close to the side boundary is 2 feet. So you have a definite guideline for a setback, right. And probably in the front and the back it has 4.5 feet and 4 feet, right. So in the front where the access way is, because you have a 25 feet wide road, 24 feet wide road from where the approach is and where the parking is. So all of that is demarcated, right. Now the largest dimension are the dimensions which are outside, which are side dimensions, and then you have the building dimensions which are there on the inside, right. Usually, or in most common cases, you also represent the dimensions of anywhere where the building line gets truncated. For example, here you have a 2 feet distance which does not change till this point, right. So you need to represent the dimensions. However, there is a difference of 5 feet which is happening at this location, right. So 2 plus 5 becomes 7, which is represented here, right. So all of the dimensions can also give you a check of actually checking your drawing whether it is correct or not, right. So that's why dimensioning is very important, particularly in case of a site plan, so that you get to measure and do not mess up when it goes on the site for execution, right. Additionally, as we started off in the previous slide, we did discuss that the north direction becomes really important. So the north is also represented here. So this is kind of a typical architectural site plan, which is a bare minimum requirement what is shown, right. So this shows the layout of the building footprint where the building will be located, right. Moving next, so what are the elements which are there, right. So the first thing is the building, right. So all the proposed and existing buildings are shown, and any surrounding buildings which are there, which are relevant to be shown as a reference. For example, when we are looking at the surveying reference, when we are looking at the site surveying slides, we did see an example that the 2 ranging rods were placed right next to an existing building, and then that particular reference was taken as a point of reference for getting the dimensions of all of our site, right. So that is, in taking consideration of that example, you may also put down that particular building from where the reference point was identified to draft the building, right. So that's really important, right. So all the buildings which are there, which are relevant to your design and site, are to be placed on the site plan. Next, as we discussed earlier, hardscape, softscape. So here particularly this will be a softscape. So all the landscaped areas are to be shown. All the natural elements which are trees, plants, grass, any man-made element, any additional things which you are going to add, like a water body, furniture or lawn or street furniture, which can probably be permanent, which will be put down with a foundation, all of that is to be mentioned on the site plan, right. Next, you have all the driveways and parking ways, parking locations, right. So for the driveways particularly, there will be different types of dimensions wherever the dimension of the driveway changes, right. Wherever the width of the driveway changes, at all those locations you have to mention the dimension as well, right. And in this case, the site entry becomes very important. In some of the larger sites, sometimes you have one entry and a second entrance, so you have 2 access locations for the site. So you have one for entry, one for exit, right. So in case of large buildings or large proposals, large scale proposals, you will have a entrance location and you will have a exit location, right. So there right, often it is written in certain way like this, right. So you have a site entry and you have a site exit, right. So in this case as well, all sites, all the ingress and egress, all the entries and exits are to be put down with the correct dimensions which are there, right, correct dimensions which are there, right, and the pathway dimensions as well. Next is utilities. Another important component, another important element which is there is the site utilities. All your water lines, sewer lines, power lines, the electric poles which are there, the electric lighting which will be there around the site, all of this is to be mentioned and identified with the exact locations where it should be placed on the site, right. So, this becomes a live reference of exactly how your site would be developed, right. Next, this is an example, right. So, in case of your buildings, these are the ways you can actually represent the buildings, various ways to represent the building on a site, right. So, the site, a building on a site can be represented in various ways depending on the style of presentation you want. If you remember, in some of the previous modules, we talked about elevation, hatching, particularly when we were talking about hatching, and I gave an example of the plaster, the sand plaster which is to be done on the facade of a building. Then in that particular case, we did talk about different ways of hatching and different styles of representation which belong to individual architect's office. So, here in this case you have hatch with hatch, right. So, you are actually filling in different types of hatches within the sheet. So, you have hatch for the building, you have hatch for the pathway, you will have hatch for the softscape, greenscape and landscape and all other elements, right, and you will also put down the trees and other things, right. So, all the elements which are being put down are represented with hatch, right. So, you are hatching that whole particular area or the whole site. Next is a colored site plan. So, you can also do a colored site plan with a legend, right, with a legend that okay, my green represents all the softscape, everything that will be grass will be represented in green, everything that is gray or brown will have gray will have roads, and brown will have your hardscape with maybe pebbles or wood chips or something like that, and everything that is beige is my building footprint, right. So, that becomes your legend, wherein you will put down all of this information in a box on the side for reference. The same thing can also be done for the hatch, right. And the next one is hatch on plane, right. So, hatch on plane or hatch on plane is going to represent what all locations are to be, what all types. So, here you are going to represent, say, this particular area is my building, right. This area is my softscape where I am going to put my flower planters or things like that, or I am going to plant my trees. So, this has a different hatch, and then you have some typical type of hatching for the road, and that is all. For all the different places or all the places where you do not have a hardscape or a softscape, all of that will not be hatched, right. So, these are the variations between these. These are just examples. There are multiple other ways which different offices adopt and they develop on top of that, right. So, that ultimately becomes a style of an architect's office, right. So, a site plan also becomes a really important tool to actually experiment and develop a architect's office style or architect's style, right, which becomes really fascinating over time, right, and also very important way of communicating your drawings, right. So, here you have technique 1, right. In technique 1 you are actually hatching the building, you know. So, here it reads that darker building shape against lighter background, right. So, you are going to make the buildings, and each of the level, wherever the level changes, you are going to represent with a particular type of a hatch, right. You are representing the planters with the expanse of the building, you are showing the center line of the building as well, right. Another technique is you do a lighter building with a dark background, right, and in this case you also show the sciography or you show the shadow of the building representing what kind of height a particular block has, right. So, in both cases the level differences are communicated, and in both cases the style switches, you know. You are in one case you are using a hatch, in another case you are using just plain. So, this is plain on hatch and this is hatch on hatch. Alright. So, these are the two techniques with which one can represent how to actually represent a particular site, particularly in the building case, right. So, in the building case you can represent it in such a way. So, moving on forward, in landscaped areas you can see that the complete site can actually be shown with all the landscape elements which are there. So, a landscape layout is a separate layout along with the site plan, right. So, sometimes some offices also show this landscape within the site layout. Sometimes there are separate sheets which are provided which will show all the landscape. So, each of the typical kind of block which is being used for a tree, say for example this and this looks almost the same. So, probably these hatches will represent what kind of tree it is, right. So, that is being shown in a legend separately. Okay. So, that becomes really important. That is a very important drawing which is to be added along with the site plan group or site plan dossier, right. The landscape material plantation also needs to be mentioned along with the building outline, right. So, here the difference, if you see, for example, here it appears to be a patio, right. So, there is a patio kind of a structure which is here, on top of which there is some kind of development, right. So, here it is a patio kind of thing, right. So, it has different kind of a material. Maybe on top of the patio or the top of the raised level they have also planted probably a lawn, it is possible, right. Or instead of doing a decking they are doing a pit and there will be a raised lawn on which people can go and sit and have maybe their meal, right. So, this kind of work or this kind of addition which will be a landscape element to the built structure need to have a variation as well and needs to have a mention as well, that what are the kind of development which are being done there, right, what kind of addition which is being done there apart from the build structure which is being proposed, right. So, all of that is important. Now, in this case as well, say you have a pool here, right, it is a pool which is visible here, this one, right. So, you have a pool here. However, on the side probably you have a landscaped area which is a lawn. So, all of this is hatched in a very different way. Then next to the pool probably all of this is tiled, right. So, you do see tiling and maybe all of this is paved. So, the parking area is paved. So, it has a completely different kind of hatch, right. So, this way all the materials are to be explained, right. Right here it also mention the details of there are any specific paving materials. For example, here next to the pool you definitely see a grid hatch, which means either it is tiled by vitrified tiles or anti-skid tiles, or maybe it is decking where they are using wood or wood like finish material, so that people do not slip when they are coming out of the pool or getting into the pool, right. So, these kind of variations are to be mentioned along with the legend on the site, right. Along with that, what is really important is all the existing trees which are there are to be represented, right. All the existing trees which are there are to be represented. All those which will be added are to be represented as well, right. So, that becomes really important. That kind of completes your first landscape layout, first landscape areas, the landscape areas of your site, right, very important. Moving on forward, trees, right. All the trees which are there on the site are to be mentioned with appropriate legend. As I was mentioning earlier, all the trees will have a different kind of representation which is to be put down. Once you go on the site, the surveyor goes on the site, the architect goes on the site. One of the first things is, after you get the first layout of the site survey, you also need to mark all the trees on top of that. The surveyor needs to do that. So, once that is done, the job of an architect or the landscape consultant, if it is a very large site, a landscape consultant might also be involved. So, you go on that site and you actually mark which tree is what type of tree, right. Say for example, you have 3 large trees here which are marked as 1 or probably A, right. You have another smaller type of a tree which is marked as Y, which repeats, right, in certain places. another type of tree which is marked as L, right. So these are different types of trees which are represented with different types of blocks or notations which are here. So the larger ones are represented in a similar way, one which is size below is represented in similar ways, right, but probably they are the same type of trees, so they are represented in a similar way, right. In case of a landscape plan, the proposed trees are to be marked and numbered, right. So the number of trees which will be in addition to the existing trees are to be marked and numbered and lettered accordingly, right, for which you will use a legend, right. So all these different types of sample tree legend which you have as an example here, all the different types of trees are to be used. This kind of a block will be put down on the site. Moving on forward, right. Next, you have a parking and driving layout plan. So say you have a large area where you have where you are doing a layout for some international school, like this example comes from an international school. So you have a gymnasium here and you have another building here which is an important building probably, for which people would need access and people are going to come and park in front of that particular area. So you need to have the dimensions. If you observe here, you need to have the dimensions of each of the bay, the driving bay which will be the parking bay which will be there. Also you need to give the driving directions, right. For example, in one of the previous slides I talked about that maybe it may so occur that you will have only one entrance point to the site and another exit point to the site, right. So this appears to be a one way entrance where you come in the site and then you go all around. Maybe this is just a drop off where people will drop off and they will then move out of the site. There is another entrance which will be used, another pathway will be used, driveway will be used from here, and then you enter the site, you go around the site and maybe park here, or you come inside, you drop off and then you go out again. So these are the variations which are there, right. So the entry and exit to the lot is very important. The direction of the movement, as I just discussed, is very important. Next, number of units of parking for four-wheeler as well as two-wheeler to be identified and to be counted is very, very important, right. So the number of parkings that are being provided by this particular space is to be counted and provided in a table or to be numbered in the parking bays itself, right. So one can number it in the parking bays itself, that these are the number of parkings that that this kind of a layout will provide, right. And along with that, you also need to provide sufficient driveway width and turning radius for the layout of this particular parking area, right. So for example, we will also show the turning radius here, turning radius here, turning radius here, so on and so forth, right. Even in this case you will probably show, okay. So all of that is to be represented and mentioned in the drawing itself, in the site layout itself, in the site plan itself, whenever you are doing a parking area, right. Sometimes if the parking area is quite large, architect's office also hires parking consultants which do all of these tasks for the architect's office and provide the best solution possible. Sometimes it also happens that the parking consultant or the parking consulting agency comes up with an updated alternative proposal which they feel more suitable for this particular solution, because they are occupied in that particular field. They are say maybe they are pioneers in that field, or they are the best in that field, and they are doing that job for a very long time of providing consultancy services for type of parking layouts to be done. Sometimes they come up with a very good solution. Often it so happens that parking area becomes really important, particularly for evacuation. That's why sometimes you require a parking consultant. Also, if a parking is in the basement, it's not on the ground level. If it is in the basement, then in that case it needs to be treated in a different way, right. It needs to be treated in a different way, because the number of landmarks which are there in a basement compared to the number of landmarks which will be available on a surface level parking like this will be definitely different. In a basement you don't have many references, so that's why often in large scale basements parking consultants are hired. Moving forward, right. So, in case of internal roads, you need to have different types of hatching, right. So, we did talk about radius for curvature, radius of road widths and all in the parking layout as well. The same thing is valid here as well. So, when you are doing internal roads, you have to mention all of these details and dimensions of the internal roads. Along with that, the roads vary with the type of roads which are there. Right, you will have the main road which is to be represented at first, the number of walkways with which the internal walkways connect from the outside. So, that is to be represented. Just to give you an example here, this walkway which is already available here connects with this walkway which is on the outside, right. So, that these are the kind of things which I am talking about, right. So, that is very important. So, how the circulation of people, how different levels of transport will link with each other. So, pedestrian transport, non-motorized transport, motorized transport, non-motorized meaning your bicycles, motorized transport meaning your two-wheelers, your four-wheelers, your trucks, all of these, how they are moving around that area. If there is a garbage collection van, where will that go? Will it go to the frontage of the building, or will it go behind where you will have a service road? So, all of these things are to be mentioned and written on top of it, or there is a different way of representation that you can differentiate it by hatch. So, the way you are hatching the kind of material which will be given to different roads can be highlighted here. And based on this, there are at least two types of road which will be there in the site. They are vehicular roads and walkways. Two definite roads are to be mentioned explicitly. Vehicular roads will have one hatch and walkways will have another kind of hatch. In most cases, walkways are often paved, or walkways will have certain types of gravel or something like that, and vehicular roads are either paved or they are blacktop. So, these are the variations which are there, but they are to be represented with different kinds of hatches which are there. We have discussed hatches earlier, so I am not getting into the details of it, right. But on the site, always remember that whenever you apply a material, that is always to be shown and represented in a material legend of all the materials which are being used on the site. So, same way valid for roads as well. If there are various different types of pathways and roads which are being proposed on a site, so all of the different material which will be used for all of these different roads and pathways is to be represented accordingly on a legend, right. Moving forward, you have utilities, right. So, what are utilities? In utilities, you have all the line department supplies, right. The line department supplies meaning your waterways, your water connection, your power connection, your sewage connection which goes out from the site, right, drainage. So, all of these things are to be represented in a certain way, right. Now, what all things are very important. So, as I mentioned, your water supply, your sewer, drainage and electric lines will be mentioned in this particular layout of the site, right. So, your utilities layout will have all of these information. Your water supply part needs to have the water reservoir, the underground water line which will be proposed in the site, the location of it, where the pipes will go, where all will you have the taps. These are the bare minimum things which are to be represented, right. Without this, a water supply layout will be considered incomplete, right. So, four things. One is your water supply, second is your sewage, third is your drainage, and fourth is your electric, right. So, these are all utilities based or utilities additions to your layouts, right, to your site plan, right, and all of the elements of these different layouts are to be represented on a site plan. So, coming to the electric supply. So, when we see electric supply, the electric lines, the meter box, the street light and the post stop lights, right. So, So, the places where you will have all of these different elements of electric supply, these are the bare minimum things which are to be mentioned definitely on the outside of that particular site layout. In sewage plan, the system designed for the sewage collection or sewage drainage is to be mentioned and highlighted on the site, right. So, the sewage plans and system designed for the site are to be mentioned in the layout accordingly. So, say if there is a very large building or a very tall building, and instead of going from door to door sewage collection, people would actually put down their garbage from a garbage chute, which is not a very good idea, but some places it is still common. So, you put down the garbage to the garbage chute. So, that kind of a design or the system which is a garbage chute is to be mentioned in this particular layout, right. So, this is just an example. Lastly, your drainage network. For your drainage network, it should include rainwater harvesting, the natural slope of runoff of water, where it is going, how it is going, and whether it connects to outside the site rainwater stormwater drains, or within the site there is some kind of rainwater harvesting tank which is being made. All of that is to be mentioned in this particular layout, right, when you are talking about drainage of the site, right. Now, a complete site layout or a complete site plan would ideally look something like this, right. So, in the site layout you will have multiple buildings. So, for example, if you consider this particular site layout as a large layout which is being proposed for a particular area. So, you will have multiple buildings all marked in white, which are the proposals, or and you will have the hatched buildings or colored buildings which are there, which are already existing. Along with that, all the vegetation, all the different kinds of trees which are being added as an addition to the site will be mentioned, as we talked about earlier. There is an existing fire station which is also mentioned. A parking location is also mentioned for bicycles, if you see here. Parking area demarcated here, right, around this area. All the roads are being represented in the correct way and hatched with a different way compared to the internal walkways which you have, which are hatched in beige, right. So, that is all about the site plan. Thank you very much.